ruled out the possibility that the killer might be a female.
So we look at every avenue. We're looking at every group of people.
Police really didn't answer that. It didn't seem to me, anyway, that it really occurred to them. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But I'm joined now by former Louisiana homicide detective Rodney Demery, who now hosts the podcast Murder Chose Me. Rod, you think this killer might, in fact, be a woman? When the odds are completely stacked against that theory, why do you think that?
Hi, Ashley. Thanks for having me. It's very likely it could be a female. The type of crime, I think the thought is that it's a mass murder, maybe some sort of serial killer, but the reality is it sounds like a passionate crime to me. I think it was someone that had a rage, a certain passion to create such violence. The wrong assumption is that could be a male. More than likely it's a female or a same-sex type relationship or something along those lines.
You think a lot of women get away with murder because, just like me, I usually think it's a man, and so do authorities.
Yeah, I think women, not necessarily do they get away with it, but I think it's probably a delay, because the first thought or the first assumption is a male, and that suspect can actually avoid detection for quite a while.
Rod, one of the things I've been noticing, and of course, look, it's the age of social media, and, girls in college are all over social media, and these girls had so much social media. They're beautiful. They've got beautiful vehicles. Kaylee bought a Range Rover. She was expecting to start a new job, in the new year. Do you think there's a potential for jealousies because of this? And that's maybe why police should be looking towards other women who see these lives that they think are so much better than theirs?
I think that's a real possibility. Social media obviously creates some sort of violence, but I think it's more likely a relationship type crime, and I think the police probably have a pretty good indication who it is. I just think they're not speaking about it.
10 seconds left. Any chance it's just the boogeyman? It's just the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world? It's just the Ted Bundys? What do you think of that?
I would say probably not. It's definitely someone within their close inner circle.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to Truth and Transparency. Happy Friday night. What is good? Jumping right into it. But before we do, let's remember that there were people out there saying from the beginning that this is somebody that these people knew. And did it have something to do with the fact that there was no signs of forced entry? Did it have something to do with that it looks like a crime of passion? And then let's not forget the fact that there are people out there that said, hey, hold up. Is this something that a female could have done? So with that said, January 10th, 2023. I'm pointing out this article because I think it's relevant. How police actually cracked the Idaho killings by Heather Tall Murphy. I say Heather tell all, baby. Investigators use forensic genealogy to zero in on suspect Brian Koberger, but they aren't saying so. Now, please pay attention to the fact that this was published on January 10th. On January 3rd, 2023, the gag order was established. Around 4 a.m. on November 13th, a masked man broke into a house about a mile from the University of Idaho campus and stabbed 4 students. Then he walked past a stunned surviving roommate and left. By the time police arrived, Kaylee, Maddie, they're both 21 years old. They were best friends. Ethan, Xana, 2 20-year-olds who were dating, they were dead. Early on in the investigation, the Moscow Police Department became interested in a white Honda Elantra that surveillance footage had captured near the house that morning. Police compiled lists of white Honda Elantras spanning from 2011 to 2016 that were registered at local universities and instructed officers to search for still more. An affidavit released last week revealed that on November 29th, just 2 weeks after the crime, these techniques succeeded in identifying a 2015 Elantra registered to Brian Koberger, a 28-year-old criminology student at nearby Washington State University. And yet, it would be another month before police arrested Brian Koberger and charged him with the murders. All the while, investigators would keep pleading for more tips about Elantras. That's because it was not Koberger's Elantra that had elevated him to a priority person of interest. Rather, according to a law enforcement source familiar with the investigation, with whom I spoke, a key reason police focused on Koberger as a likely suspect has to do with something that is never mentioned in the 18-page affidavit: forensic genealogy. Again, really highlighted there is according to a law enforcement source. Okay. It was only after investigators utilized a technique reliant on genealogy databases to determine who'd left DNA on a tan leather knife sheath that police requested a search warrant for Koberger's phone records. Let me repeat that for the cheap seats. This woman is saying it was only after investigators utilized a technique, IgG, in the databases to determine who'd left the DNA on the tan leather knife sheath that police requested a search warrant for Koberger's phone records, according to this source. Boom. This source is a police investigator. This source is not another writer. She says it right here. Rather, according to a law enforcement source. Are we clear? I'm putting it in black and white for everybody to see. Her source is not another writer. Her source is law enforcement. And this law enforcement source told her that from IgG, we then got a search warrant for his phone records. Up until that point, in late December, he hadn't stood out among all the other Elantra owners, the source said, again, making it seem like they knew the name Brian Koberger and was investigating him, or at least looked into him in some capacity beginning on November 29th. Something that is reinforced by a close, informed reading of the affidavit. The precise way forensic genealogy helped investigators zero in on Mr. Koberger hasn't been previously reported. This is one of the most high-profile cases in which this relatively new, ethically contentious method has been used so soon after a crime has been committed, and it will likely influence how law enforcement approaches it going forward. Though multiple news outlets, including CNN and ABC News, reported that forensic genealogy helped with the case, none has explained how it was used or why it did not appear in the affidavit. That how and why matters. For one thing, it shows that a method known mostly for solving cold cases can apply to ones that are still hot. That may increase demand for an emerging field that was already experiencing a boom. The use of forensic genealogy also underlines that the current storyline, the narrative about how police identified their suspect, which some are suggesting is a model, is missing pivotal details. According to numerous genetic genealogists, the case embodies an emerging trend of leaving out any mention of forensic genealogy from court documents and press conferences. The Idaho affidavit's thoughtful omission, in quotes, of any reference to genealogy, as forensic DNA analysis Tiffany Roy put it, has reignited a heated debate among investigative genealogists, lawyers, detectives, and other forensic experts about the wisdom of this strategy. The people involved in Kohberger's arrest won't be weighing in anytime soon. On January 3rd, shortly after Moscow police announced the arrest, a judge in Idaho issued a gag order. That would then suggest that she either got this information after the gag order, right? Or integrity would tell you that she had her law enforcement source prior to the gag order. And therefore she felt comfortable writing this. Now, those of you guys that have been following the Karen Reed case, in the Karen Reed case, they 100%, when I say they, the state, the prosecutors, they went after the Boston Globe to get material from the media. Now, again, on January 3rd, shortly after Moscow police announced the arrest, a judge in Idaho issued a gag order prohibiting anyone involved in this case from speaking about it in order to encourage a fair trial. This order also applies to Kohberger's defense team, which did not respond to a request for comment. Kohberger is expected to appear in court again on Thursday. The Hyundai Elantras are among the best-selling compact cars in America. White is among most common color. And so it is not surprising that within 24 hours of requesting tips about the white Hyundai Elantra on its Facebook page on December 7th, the Moscow Police Department had received so many that it had to devise a new system for accepting them. By December 27th, the agency had a list of 22,000 white Elantras. One of the ways investigators whittled down the vehicle's owners was by looking for associated mobile phones that pinged cell towers near the crime scene around the time of the murder. Kohberger failed to stand out in that way, according to the affidavit. A query, in quotes, of the 8458 phone in these returns did not show the 8458 phone utilizing cellular tower resources in close proximity to the King Road residence between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. End quote. Brett Payne, Moscow Police Department's lead investigator, wrote, referring to Kohberger's phone. What this likely meant was that there was no immediate reason to prioritize Kohberger over other Elantra owners. On December 23rd, 3 weeks after Kohberger's Elantra first made the list, Payne applied for a search warrant for records of Koberger's phone activity between November 12th and November 14th. The results helped convince Payne that Koberger was the Elantra owner he was looking for after all. Now, we now know, because Officer Payne testified back in May, we now know that Officer Payne did not know, under oath he said he did not know that Brian Koberger existed until December 19th. And he did not talk to anybody concerning to WSU until December 20th. In quotes, the route of travel of the 8458 phone during the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, and the lack of the 8458 phone reporting to AT&T between 2:47 a.m. and 4:48 a.m. is consistent with Koberger's attempting to conceal his location during the quadruple homicide that occurred at the King Road residence, end quote, he wrote. So the question is, what happened shortly before Christmas that refocused? Because I cannot reiterate this, that everybody and anybody, this would include Judge, and this would include Megan Marshall, magistrate judge, everybody and their mother, and anybody who would read that affidavit would be under the impression that Payne had Brian Koberger and started working on Brian Koberger on November 29th, and that is why it is in chronological order that way. Hence, so the question is, what happened shortly before Christmas that refocused Payne's attention on this particular Elantra owner? The answer, according to the source familiar with the investigation, is partly that the officer got back the results from forensic genealogy team. And what does this mean? It means you relied on IGG. As court documents state, during his exploration of the house, Payne found a leather knife sheath stamped with a Marine Corps eagle containing a quote-unquote single source of male DNA on its button snap. Had their suspect been arrested for or convicted of a felony in one of the states that are aggressive about collecting DNA, officials might have found him by searching a criminal database. But Koberger's most notable previous interaction with police occurred this past fall when he applied for an internship to work for the Pullman Police Department. And so in the end, investigators would turn to an alternative way of identifying DNA, which rose to prominence following the 2018 arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer, in what's widely referenced or referred to as the Golden State Killer case. Idaho State Police has a contract with Ortham, a forensic genealogy company, to conduct genealogy testing, according to a July 2021 memo. Ortham and Idaho State Police Forensic Services declined to comment. Once the DNA profile is ready, it gets uploaded to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, if not both. These are two primary genealogy sites that permit some type of law enforcement searches. The FBI played a role in the forensic genealogy work in the Idaho case, according to the source familiar with the investigation. something several genealogists confirmed would be likely to happen in such a high-profile investigation. The FBI declined to comment, and Anthony Dollinger, spokesperson for the Moscow Police Department, wrote, "Due to the gag order issued by our judge, I am not allowed to discuss the case in any form." Well, I guess we can go ahead and say that Dollinger is not the source, unless they're trying to play, unless this is a way to cover up for her source, right? Regardless who is conducting the investigation, genealogists look for particular matches, hoping to find relatives within the third cousin range. They then begin the process of building an enormous family tree using a vast array of public records and more traditional detective work to create a short list of people within that tree who could plausibly be the suspect. The fact that Kober lived 10 miles from the crime scene would have helped him stand out. So too would the fact that he owned a white Elantra. This is somebody with lots of information, huh? Still, even after pulling the phone records, the team had no way to be certain Koberger's DNA would match the knife sheath DNA. A genetic genealogy lead is just a hypothesis. After all, a final step typically involves conducting surveillance on the suspect and then collecting something they've discarded, such as a cigarette butt or a soda can, extracting DNA from it and comparing it with the crime scene DNA. On December 27th, agents collected trash from outside the Pennsylvania home where Koberger was visiting his parents. According to the affidavit, the Idaho State Lab reported that there was an extremely high probability it contained DNA belonging to the suspect's father. On December 30th, agents arrested Koberger. Soon after Koberger appeared in front of a judge in Idaho, the court released this affidavit. Some suggested that the absence of any reference to forensic genealogy meant that it had not been utilized after all. But there is another explanation. Forensic genealogy leaders at the FBI and beyond have directed police departments to omit all references to the technique. Numerous people involved in these investigations told me. The only reason it would show up in a probable cause document or search warrant these days is if a police department rejected their guidance as to whether keeping it out of court documents is a problem. Two primary camps have emerged over the past few days. The first camp says leaving it out is offensive. The technique relies on members of the public who've chosen to opt in to genealogy databases to allow law enforcement to use their DNA profiles to help identify their relatives. Therefore, the public deserves to know when it is used. Contrary to what many people think, Ancestry and 23andMe don't easily enable law enforcement searches. So GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA are what we're talking about here. With Family Tree DNA, you're opted in by default. With GEDmatch, users have to click a box. Because it's not in these court documents, it's difficult to know how many times it's been used or the kinds of cases in which law enforcement applies it. Why hide it? Asked Greg Hampikanen, a biology professor at Boise State University, who also the director of the Idaho Innocence Project. Having worked on 2 cases in Idaho in which forensic genealogy helped clear 2 people who were wrongfully convicted of murder, He knows firsthand that the foundational science is solid and the technique is valuable. But he's observed that the longer a novel forensic method stays hidden, the more room there is for errors in its application. Let's go get it tested in court and let's tell the public about it, he said. Roy, the forensic DNA analyst, made similar points in a LinkedIn post that sparked a fiery debate over the weekend, again in January of 2023. In a follow-up interview, Roy noted that when investigators get a DNA hit in CODIS, the FBI's criminal database, they typically mention it in an affidavit. Getting a partial match in a genealogy database should be similarly included, she said. Early on, prominent forensic genealogists and database managers allowed genetic profiles to be searched in ways that violated customer service agreements. Investigators also lied to relatives of people they found through these databases. She believes that more scrutiny is needed to ensure police don't abuse their power, and she dismisses the argument that keeping the technique out of affidavits protects the privacy of the suspect's family members because police have already used this information. They are using privacy as a shield and a sword at the same time. The second camp says that these people need to chill out because an affidavit of probable cause is supposed to explain why police believe someone is their suspect, not how they arrived at that conclusion. And then this is where this case is different. Because they're right about that. Until you lie in your probable cause affidavit, then there's an issue. You don't typically include anonymous tips or internet searches in the document. You want to know what my counter to that is? People that call in anonymous tips don't get to use evidence from the crime scene to create their anonymous tip. That's comparing oranges to apples, in my opinion. If I'm providing an anonymous tip because I saw something or I have information because after the fact somebody told me that they did it and I'm just going to come clean, or but an anonymous tip, in my opinion, is completely different because the tip that you created, you took evidence from the crime scene to then use to create then your tip. This isn't that different. They insist giving that you would never use a genetic genealogy lead to arrest someone, only to take the next step and collect DNA from them to compare with the crime scene sample. Again, their own policy wasn't even followed, unless the FBI did it. If the FBI did everything, and then when they turned over the name Brian Kober on December 19th, wouldn't the FBI have done everything themselves before they would have ever turned over the name? Well, in this case, in my opinion, that's exactly what they did. And that's exactly why Jay, in a June 22nd write-up, wrote that their argument here, the state apparently thinks that they need not explain how they came to think that it was Mr. Koberger's DNA on the sheath. Presumably, the defense is expected to accept at face value that the sheath had touched DNA just waiting for testing by all the FBI's myriad resources. Additionally, the defense is to guess While the state focused its investigation on Mr. Koberger via a bizarrely complex DNA tree experiment or through its faulty identification of the vehicle involved in this case. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Mr. Koberger does not accept that his defense does not need this information. It rather obviously falls within the ambit of Rules 16b4 and 5, a fact that the state's briefing makes clear in its kitchen sink approach to their briefing. To begin with, the state apparently only wants to prevent Mr. Koberger from seeing how the IgG profile was created and how many other people the FBI chose to ignore during their investigation. In essence, the state argues that if the later STR testing is accurate, then there is no reason to concern ourselves with how the state came to investigate Mr. Koberger. State's brief at 9. With that said, clearly Heather Tull Murphy has a source, a law enforcement source that clearly said, and if she recorded her interviews or she has notes on her interviews, she was clearly provided that said, rather, according to a law enforcement source familiar with the investigation with whom I spoke, a key reason police focused on Koberger as a likely suspect has to do with something that is never mentioned in the 18-page affidavit, forensic genealogy. It was only after investigators utilized this technique, okay? IgG, it was only after investigators utilized this technique and accessed the databases to determine who'd left the DNA on a tan leather knife sheath that police requested a search warrant for Koberger's phone records. Up until that point, in late December, he hadn't stood out among all the other Elantra owners, the source said. The source also says she says what this likely meant was that there was no immediate reason to prioritize Koberger over the other Elantra owners, because she's speaking of the fact that they came across him on November 29th, meaning that Moscow Police Department knew about Brian Koberger on November 29th. Now, we know that based on Payne's statements, he did not know about Brian until December 19th. But in his affidavit, he made it seem like he knew about Brian on November 29th. On December 23rd, 3 weeks after Koberger's Elantra first made the list, Payne applied for a search warrant for records of Koberger's phone activity between November 12th and November 14th. The results helped convince Payne. The results helped convince Payne that Kober was the Elantra owner he was looking for after all, like he was looking and came across it before. So the question is, what happened shortly before Christmas that refocused Payne's attention on this particular Elantra owner? Refocused. Now, but according to Payne, he never had to refocus anything because he was never focused at any point in time prior to December 19th, Brian Koberger. Even Moscow Police Department's source thinks that they got to Brian Koberger and knew about him on November 28th or 29th, rather. If you guys don't think that Ann Taylor doesn't know who this woman's source is, I think you're dead wrong. The answer, according to the source familiar with the investigation, is partly that the officer got back the results from a forensic genealogy team. Zoop. Last thing. At a June 27th, 2023 motion to compel hearing, there was 2 requests that left off anything that they were about. Request 17 and request 23. During the quick 26-minute hearing, at the end of the motion to compel, Ann Taylor gets up and she says, Judge, the reason we are seeking these 3 Idaho State Police training records are because these 3 Idaho State Police officers have conducted the following. Number 1, like Officer 1, they did a Spillman search for 2011 to 2013 Elantras to give to the FBI. Officer number 1 also did and helped with the search for Elantras. They assisted with the search of Elantras. Officer number 1 still did at 1122 King Road, interviewed people on 1113 from the scene. Continuing on with Officer 1, they did a follow-up of key witnesses. Continuing on with Officer 1, this Idaho State Police officer signed an Ada County lab agreement. An Ada County lab agreement. And this officer handled and collected evidence. Officer number 2, this person from Idaho State Police interviewed a key witness that will that will testify at this trial. And this Idaho State police officer said that they have a specialty with working with trauma witnesses. This main key witness that we're speaking of had multiple interviews, of which this person at least did one of them. And then the last officer, the third Idaho State police officer, had multiple interviews, at least 12, and many of them were after the arrest of Brian Koberger. This officer, too, interviewed key witnesses, attended the autopsy, and made decisions about which tips were important, the direction of the investigation. And this third officer also collected evidence. On June 27th, 2023, at this motion to compel hearing, in quotes, Ashley Jennings says, in quotes, Ms. Taylor has everything that we have to include MPD's report of cast. In quotes, Ms. Taylor says, I believe I have communications between the FBI and the police on how and why the Elantra changed from 2011 to 2013 to then including 14, 15, and 16. I believe, in quotes. Ann Taylor said at this motion to compel, bits and pieces of the investigation that we don't have, that the FBI relied on and did analysis on, it is at the end of June, and we still don't have any reports from anything that the affidavit relied on for the arrest of my client. There was a variety of search warrants that relied on information that we still are not in possession of, Judge. The cast, the identification. And Ann Taylor wanted a date. And the date that Judge said that you have to get this material, and Ashley Jennings agreed, was July 14th, 2023. Literally just 17 days later was the FBI supposed to provide this stuff to the prosecutors, and the prosecutors were supposed to supply it to the defense. January 23rd, 2025, next Thursday, is going to be literally off the hook. Why? Very simple. in probable cause, you don't have to show all your cards or do anything like that. You're showing probable cause, and the probable cause standard is right here. But what you cannot do in a probable cause affidavit is everything that Ann Taylor is saying that Moscow Police Department did. So then I thought about it. I personally believe that the FBI was running their own investigation. But the whole time, we were always told that the FBI was assisting Moscow Police Department and working together on this case. Why wouldn't you tell and include Moscow Police Department in and when your findings, and then we get the name Brian Kober from the IGG hit, and let's say it's in November, but then we have to, just because we get this name, then we're going to go out there and we're going to lift Brian's DNA. We're going to swipe his car where the handles are. We're going to get papers back from maybe that he graded and turned over and handed back, or items that he would have discarded at lunch, or anything of that nature. But we're doing all of this. And here this whole time, you would think that Moscow Police Department was with them doing this together, because it was Moscow Police Department's case. So ask yourselves, with procedure, when does the FBI run their own investigation and do everything themselves, and then at the last minute dump off, as Payne is saying and suggesting, that we didn't get the name Koberger from the FBI until the 19th? Why would the FBI keep that from Moscow Police Department? Why? Why wouldn't Officer Payne know what the FBI is doing once they would have gotten the name Brian Koberger back from their genealogists? That would protocol as you go and you give it to the detective, right? And the detective then goes and tries to obtain the DNA of the suspect, and then you give that back to the lab for them to test against what they have. And then once that's a match, then you start building your case in terms of all these other things, like, okay, he has this white Elantra. He is a criminology student. Okay, how are you obtaining search warrants? If you can't say that you got the DNA and lifted it in secrecy, but then tested it against the sheath. What if the FBI just didn't trust Moscow Police Department? Because all it screams to me is there's a huge trust issue. what it also screams to me is that how would Payne not know, or anybody from Moscow Police Department not know, that Brian Koberger's name, if found by WSU's staff, 2 men, in the early morning hours of November 29th, how does that truly not get back to the Moscow Police Department? How is that kept under wraps in any possible situation when Moscow Police Department is working so closely all the time with WSU for all types of events, all types of incidences, because kids go back and forth? There is a source out there that told a reporter that they relied on investigative genetic genealogy to get the search warrants. Now, don't you think that'd be a pretty interesting witness to call to the stand for a suppression hearing? Especially if the dates of when this person was talking to this reporter. Because maybe I don't ask you who your source was, but can we talk about other information and when you gathered this information and when you were told this information? Is it relevant? Idaho's a one-party state. I don't know about you, but when I would conduct interviews, it's normal to record people. It's normal to take notes. It's normal to document your stuff, and you would keep it. What if the source for this story was Detective Mowry? What if the source for this information was anybody that wrote up a report in connection with this case? Remember, there was 120 officers involved in this case. 120. Look at the title of this lovely article. How police actually cracked the Idaho killings case. Actually. She thinks that the how and the why matters. Cyber Ninja, happy Friday, all. Thank you so much. 14-month membership. 503 Decal, member for 9 months. Baby time. Whoop, whoop. Look out. I believe AT will prove Ellie abused DNA loophole. Here's another question for you. How did the knife sheath DNA come back and have your raw data STR, here it is, November 20th, they were able to lift and see that and pick up that there was a single source of male unknown DNA on the knife sheath, November 20th. How come the lab didn't know until December 17th that there were 3 other unknown distinct male DNA at the crime scene? 2, right? 2 of those being in near proximity of the victims, and then the other one being on a glove outside the house. Why wouldn't those be picked up sooner? How many samples, comparison DNAs did they obtain to run these hits against? Because a lot of these aren't going to be in CODIS. These aren't felons, but they are going to be people that these girls know and who should be in that home or who they've ever come in contact with, things like that. Are you willing to submit your DNA so we can rule out, the DNA that we have? In the Delphi murders, the crime scene DNA that they were attempting to lift, whether it's like on, there was mixtures so they couldn't separate it. But they're working within this crime scene to test items to see if there's DNA. So with the crime scene, with the Idaho4 case, what do you think would have been tested where they would have lifted the 2 unknown male DNAs that are inside the house when they only took in 103 pieces of evidence for the lab to then pick and choose where they're going to test something? For example, the hoodie in the Delphi case. It was submitted for testing the first time and only took so many swabs in certain spots. Then they submitted it a second time, which was like a month later. And when they submitted it the second time, they swabbed multiple, in addition, like 20 some places. Whereas the first time they only took like 5 or 6 swabs to try to lift skin cells from different parts of the hoodie that Liberty was wearing. So the question that people should ask themselves is, if you have a bunch of friends, and for the Delphi case, there was 400 DNA comparison samples that they had to go ahead and compare to rule out, okay, this is this person. So it would make sense that it's there. It's the brother of Ethan's, and then you have certain people. So in this case, in the Idaho4 case, how many comparison DNAs did they, go out and get? Hey, would you be willing to submit your DNA so that we can we're attempting to see, at the end of the day, out of all of this DNA they would have obtained, right, from all these different people, they were still unable. There's 3 unknowns, 2 of which are in very, very close proximity to the slain students. And it's not matching anybody that they're close friends with, family members. Think about that. Don't you think that that's important in a case? And if you're the lab, the Idaho State Police lab, what were you doing and were you running those samples again? Like what you had, were you running that against stuff? Like, don't you think those are going to be really important questions to ask? Because you would think that this case could potentially have multiple perpetrators. What was everybody doing in the Moscow Police Department literally up until December 19th? That's what's going to be so interesting to see these reports and to see what they were working on up until December 19th. Because whatever the FBI was doing, according to Payne, they really weren't working together because the FBI was doing their own thing. But I thought they were supposed to be, we're providing our sources, we're providing help to Moscow. Like, they're keeping this investigation. They didn't even turn it over to the Idaho State Police. And then according to Ann Taylor, there's reports out there where Idaho State police officers are assisting the FBI they ran a Spillman report to locate 2011 to 2013 Elantras. Nothing was said about 14, 15, or 16s. Who's that officer in Idaho State Police that was helping somebody in the FBI and providing things like that to the FBI? Because wouldn't they also be providing that to Moscow Police Department? If you're keeping the lead investigator in the loop of what you're doing? Because isn't Officer Payne in charge of this, which means that you're delegating duties? And when you're delegating duties, then you normally follow up with who you delegated the shit to say, hey, what do you got back on that I told you to do? But we heard him testify. And he doesn't know anything about anything. Is that Holly in here? Thank you guys for joining. Less than a week away. It's going to be Christmas Eve all over again. How police actually cracked the Idaho killings case is what we've been told. And this woman, she knows it. This woman here, she knows it. She can prove it. She has a source. And I want to know if it's going to be revealed. I want to know if she could be possibly one of the subpoenas. I want to know if the Deuce Tecum. I want to know. This is the time to pull this out, right? Peace out, Girl Scouts. Keep it real.